Daf Tzadi Aleph Amud Aleph will begin the Mishnah at the bottom of Tzadi Daf Tzadi Amud Beis. Zok the Mishnah Ha'oinen, someone who's an oinen, meaning one of his relatives were nifter that day. It's upon him to be Isaac in the Kavura. Ha'oinen, someone who's an oinen, b'mafakech segal, or someone who clears out a pile of rubble. There was a collapse, a building collapse, or something of that nature, and it collapsed on a person, and it's not known if the person there is alive or dead, but he may be that he is a mess. And therefore, if the person is clearing it out, he is being mile over the mess, so he might be tome. Or someone where the captors or the people who were imprisoned him promised him to release him from prison by night. And someone is sick and an old person, but they're old and sick, but they're at least able currently to eat a kazayis of the balls for the Korban Pesach. We can check the balsar, the shech, the Korban Pesach for them. Meaning, the Korban Pesach has to be shechted for someone who's capable of eating the Korban Pesach. Now, in Oinen, the first case in the Mishnah, Oinen, currently he's not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. But by nightfall, the Isra of eating kosher is a Durban. With the Raisa, he would be able to eat the Korban Pesach. Therefore, you can shech for him. He can be someone that you can shech for because he's Minatayr, he's capable of eating the basa. Someone who is Mefakech Sagal, we don't know if he's Tomei or Tor. But he has a chazaka that he's currently tor. So even though it's possible that he is mal over the maze, but he has a chazaka. So you can shtal on a chazaka, and therefore he's deemed to be tor, and therefore capable of eating the boss of the Korban Pesach. The person who's a prisoner, and they promise to release him from prison, therefore that can be relied on, and therefore say he's somebody that by nightfall he'll be released, and he can therefore eat from the Korban Pesach. Someone is a chayil or zaken, now he currently can eat, even though it's possible that by nightfall his situation will deteriorate and he won't be able to eat, but currently he can. So therefore, you can shech the Korban Pesach for him. Al kulam, however, in all of these cases, ain't shech l'mivnei atzman. You can't shech for them alone. There have to be other people in the chabura. Shem yaviz a Pesach lidei psul, because perhaps they'll bring the Korban Pesach lidei psul, because in all of these cases, perhaps they won't be able to eat from the Korban Pesach. The Oinen, even though Minatayr he's allowed to eat by nightfall, but since he is Isaac in the mace, he might become Tomei, and therefore perhaps he won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach. Perhaps it'll turn out that when he was clearing out the rubble, there was a person who was a nifter, and there was a mess there, and he was mal the mace, and he's Tomei. Or perhaps the case when the person who was in jail, perhaps they won't release him from jail. Or perhaps the situation of the Chayil Zaken will deteriorate, so therefore we don't rely on him that he should be the one that is the only one in the Chabura that is your shechting the Pesach for, because at the end of the day, it might bring the Pesach lidei psul because they might not be able to eat it. Lefichach, therefore, im behem psul, since we are allowed to shech for them, so at the time we shechted that it was a kosher korban, and therefore even afterwards, if there does occur a psul, and they aren't allowed to eat the Korban Pesach, nevertheless, P'tur Melas is Pesach Sheni, but they're still parted from Pesach Sheni because it was a kosher shchita for them, the Korban Pesach Rishon that was done for them. Chutz min mefakech sagal, except for the case of mefakech sagal, shu tomei mitchilosa, because in that case, if we find that there was a mess under the rubble, then we would assume that he was nifter even from beforehand, and therefore we would assume that the person who is clearing away the rubble was mahel over the mace, and he was tomei at the time of the shchita, and therefore his shchit, his Korban Pesach, it was possible, because we assume that he was tomei from before. Tosfos asks, why should we assume that he was tomei from before? Why maybe the mess was nifter only after he was mefakeach, and maybe he only died later. and he was not mahel over the mes. Taisus answers, because by tuma we apply the principle of kol tumas kashas mitziasim. If we find him to be nifter now, if he is dead now, we have therefore will assume he is in that state, and he was in that state even beforehand, back to the point where we know that he was alive. We would assume if he's mes now, and that's a status that he has now, he had that status even beforehand, and we would say that we would, someone that came into contact with him would be considered tomei, back and going back to the time where we knew that certainly the person was alive. But in all the period of time which is uncertain, we would say he's tomei based on the fact that the mes is nifter right now. So the Gemara, the case where we said that he was in jail, that we say that we are not sure if they're going to keep their word, and therefore we can't shecht him for him alone. That's only if it's the jailers are the Kachavim. Aval Beis Asurim Yisrael, if it's a jail where it's run by Yisrael, by Yidden, shechtem b'fnei asan, we can shech the Korban Pesach even if there's no one else in the Chabur. And we don't have to be concerned that they won't keep their word and he won't be able to eat the Korban Pesach and you'll bring it to the base of Psul. Why is that? Because since they promised him, Mafkil, they'll keep the word and they will release him from prison. The remnant of Klal Yisrael won't do anything which is an avla, and they won't speak any lies. If they promise that they will release him, we can rely on that they will in fact release him. That we said that Mishnah is talking about a jail of that's only if the jail is outside the walls of Beis Pagi, that area that's called Beis Pagi. But if it's within the walls of Beis Pagi, you can check the Korban Pesach for him, even for him alone. Because even if they don't release him, you can still bring the meat to him and he can eat it there. Because the Beis Pagi is considered part of Yerushalayim, and the Korban Pesach can be eaten within the walls of Yerushalayim, and therefore, even if they don't keep their word, you can still bring the meat and he can eat it there. So therefore, you could shecht it for him even if he's alone. So therefore, we say if there was a Mishnah said that if there became a psul, and therefore they're not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach, but nevertheless they are parted from Pesach Sheni, except for the case where someone is mevakech as a gal. But in the other cases, they're parted from Pesach Sheni because we say it was a kosher Pesach, it was a kosher Korban Pesach. This that we say with the exception of the mace, that we say, well, he was mahel over this mace, and we treat this mace as being nifter at that time, so he was tomei at the time of the shlit of the Korban Pesach, and therefore it's possible, and he's chayiv of Pesach Sheni. That's only if it's round. The pile is round. Aval gal oroch, but if it's elongated, then potter melasas Pesach Sheni. Then he's potter. Because Ema Torah b'shas shchita, because then perhaps it would say that he was Torah on the time of shchita. It's not certain to say that he was Tomei. Meaning, we say as follows: if it's a round pile, then the person was digging out from the top of the pile. So he was standing over the pile. He was definitely mahel over the mace, and it's assumed to be that if this person was nifter, found to be mace, he was mace even beforehand. But if it's a elongated pile, then maybe he was standing at one end of it, and he was digging out at one end, and on the other end of it, that's where the mace was, and therefore he was not mahel over the mace at the time of the shchita. So at the time of the shchita, perhaps he was not mahel over the mace, because it could be that he was digging out at one end, which was where the mace was not located, and at the time of the shchita, he was not mahel over the mace, and therefore we would say that the the korban is kosher. It's a kosher korban Pesach because we will not therefore say he certainly was mile over the maze. Tanya Namahachi, we learned similarly in Bryce. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai ben Yomi Masechet Pesachim, as far as the case of being mafakech halagal, eating potter, eating b'chayim. Sometimes he's potter, and sometimes he's chayim. Sometimes he's potter from Pesach Sheni, sometimes he's chayim. Ketzad, how is that? Gal, all go if it's around, when it's a tumah tachtav, and there's tumah underneath, then we say he's chayim. Then we say he's chayim because he was certainly mahil over the mez. If it's elongated, if it's elongated and there's tuma under one end of it, then it's potter, because because perhaps at the time of the shlit he was not ma'il over it, and perhaps he was tor. And in the case of a sofek, like we learned previously, that you cannot bring a Pesach Sheni. So the Mishnah ain't shaykh to Pesach al yochid. You can't check the Korban Pesach for a single person, for a single individual. Rav Yehuda. That is what Rav Yehuda holds. But Rav Yossi says no, it's mutter. As long as that Yochid can eat from the balls of Korban Pesach, it's mutter. And you can check for him alone. Va'afilu chabur shel meya. And therefore, Rav Yossi demonstrate that the issue is whether he can eat from it or not, because even if there's a chabur of 100 people, and they can't eat a kazayas of basar, and you can't check the Korban Pesach form. So it's not the number of people that's significant, it's not the total amount of people, it's the ability to eat a kazayas basar. So the way Rashi learns is that as long as the Yochid can eat a kazayas basar, you can shacht it for a Yochid. Ram says it's not enough that the Yochid can eat the kazayas basar. Ram holds that the Korban Pesach has to be completely consumed, so he has to be able to eat the entire korban. If you can eat the entire korban, that's when Rav Yossi says it's mutter, and even then Rav Yehuda says it's not. Now, as far as a chabur of 100, so the way Rashi learns is that Afil Chabur Shel Meya, Rav Yossi holds that as long as one person can eat a kazayas basar is kosher. Rambam says no, it has to be each and every one of the Chabura has to be able to eat a kazayas basar. I'll combine with that's machlokes if you can check the Korban Pesach for one individual. The Mishnah concludes, you cannot make a group composed of Noshim, Avarim, and Ketanim. The Gemara will discuss, we'll see in the Gemara what the reason for that is, and what the particular circumstances are as well. So the Gemara how do we know that you can't shech the Korban Pesach for a single individual? The Torah says you can't shech the Korban Pesach ba'achad sharech. You can't shech the Korban Pesach where the literal means in one of your cities outside of Yerushalayim, but we darshan loisis ba'losuch haliz Pesach ba'achad. You can't shech the Korban Pesach for one person. Div Rav Yehuda. That's what Rav Yehuda says. Rav Yossi Aimer. That Yochid, Rav Yossi says no. If he's a Yochid v'yochel and he's able to eat the Korban Pesach, shaychnelo. Asara, but if there's 10, even if there's 10, but they can't eat it, ain't shachtam alayim. You can't, you don't shach for it. It's not the number of people that's significant, according to Rav Yossi, it's the ability to eat the Korban Pesach. What does he do with the bi'achad? So why does the Torah say, why does it specify ba'achad sharech? If it's sharech, what's ba'achad? So the more answers mi bayla like Rav Shimon. You need it for Rav Shimon's Rosh. The son of Rav Shimon Oimer minayin lezavechas pesach bebamas yachid b'shas Yisrael b'amois. How do I know that a person shechs the Korban Pesach and a bamas yachid at the time of Isser Bamas, when there was a Mishkan with the Beis HaMikdash, then a person could not have his private mizbeach, his private bama. How do you know that a person at that time, when there's a Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, that if he shechs the Korban Pesach on his private mizbeach, that who beloisase, that he's over a loisase. It says you can't shech the Korban Pesach in one of your cities. Therefore, there's a loisase and shechting it outside of Yerushalayim. You can't shecht it in one of your cities. You might think that at the time of a heter bombas, when it's mutter to shecht on a private mizbeach, meaning when there's no base of mikdash, those periods of time when you could make a private mizbeach. Now, even in those periods of time when you can have your own private mizbeach, but those are only for the dorm and the dovas, but not for kaiva karbonas that you have a chiyuv. You would not be allowed to shech the Korban Pesach there, even at the time of heter bombas. But you might think that there's also a loisase involved. The same lav would be involved. Talmud loymam ba'achad sharecha. It says, "Ba'achad sharecha lo yamru el b'shah shekol Yisrael nechnasem b'sharechad." We darshan it. When is that so? That's only at the time when they all go into one city, meaning when there is a Beis Hamikdash, when there's Yerushalayim. So we darshan the pasuk is loy suchal le'lizbach hazapasach ba'achad. When is this loisase apply? That this loisase applies. That it's when only at the time b'shash Yisrael nechnasim b'shar echad. When is the loisase? When they all come together in the designated location, Yerushalayim. So that's when the loisase applies. But the shas of heter abomas, even though you can't be makav Korban Pesach there, but there's no loisase. So that's what he darshans with the echad. Rav Yehuda, Hai Menale, where does Rabbi Yehuda learn that from? Tati Sham, he learns both from there. How do you know that this is what the pasuk is for, to teach us what Rav Shimon is saying? Then look at Amar Rav Yehuda would also. Now, even if you're only going to learn one drasha from it, why pick the drasha of Rav Shimon, of this, the loisase of the Bayashas heter bomas, that it's not applicable? Maybe you should darshan. Why does he pick that and not the drasha of Rav Yehuda that ain't shaykh them a pesach ala yachid? Amar lach loisal kadait laksiv ish lefi achle. It says ish lefi achle. It says ish in the singular lefi achle tachaisu alasa, which means you can shech the carbon. You can shech the carbon even for an ish, even for a yachid. Ramile Ravuk Bar Chinan Parishna Lorava Mi Amar Yehuda Ein Shaykh L'Mesach Pesach Ala Yachid. Did he say that? Is that true? Vrimin, I'll ask you a stira. Isha, as far as a woman, Barishan on Pesach Rishon, Shaykh L'Lev B'fnei Asma. You can shech for her alone. Ubesheni Oisin Oisot Tefela L'Achir. But on Pesach Sheni, there's no chiyuv for nashim, so you can't shech for her alone, but she can be part of a group with others. Div Rav Yehuda. So what do you see over here? But on Pesach Rishon, you can shech for her alone. So you see that you could shech the Korban Pesach for a yachid. Omerle says, "Loitem b'fnei atzma." Don't say for her alone. Ela ema b'fnei atzman, for them, for women, for a group that's comprised entirely of women, but not for a single woman, not for a singular woman. How can you interpret that way? Do we in fact make a chabura which is only women? We learned in our Mishnah, we don't make a chabura of women and avodim and ketanim. My love, what does this mean? Doesn't that mean my love nashim lechudayu, va'avadim lechudayu, uktanim lechudayu? Doesn't it mean a chabura comprised entirely of women? You can't do. Entirely ketanim you can't do, and avodim entirely ketanim you cannot do. So how can you interpret it to mean that you can make it for a chabura on Pesach Rishon of entirely of women? Omralei said no, loy, that's not what it means. What our Mishnah means, Nashim Avodim Ketanim, means that you can't make a chabura combining them all together. But a chabura which is entirely of women, you could. Nashim Avodim Ketanim, Nashim Avodim Shum Tiflos. You can't do for women and avodim together because of tiflos. It'll be pritzos together if they're together in one chabura. And ketanav avodim, you can't do it together. Mishum pritzusa, because of pritzos. Meaning, if that women and avodim is tiflos, they'll have late sonas and they'll They'll have we're chayshish for isnos, and Ketan Vavarim is mishum pritzos because of mishkav zocher. Therefore, we separate them from each other. However, on Noshim, you could have a Chabura comprised entirely of Noshim, and that's what it means. On Pesach Rishon you can, but not on Pesach Sheni, because on Pesach Sheni, they're not mechuyev in Pesach Sheni.